Tension hung thick as the officers overturned crates, searching for contraband. One recruit, barely out of training, kept sneaking glances at the fisherman's hand knuckles scarred, fingers bent from decades of work. But as the search neared its end, something caught his eye, a tarnished, star-shaped medal, half hidden beneath a pile of gear. The fisherman's posture remained too straight, too controlled, like someone used to command. Just as the recruit opened his mouth to speak, a senior officer's radio hissed to life. The voice on the other end was sharp, urgent. "Abort the search, now." The team leader turned back to the old man, demeanor shifting in an instant. The apology hung in the air, unspoken, as the morning's routine threatened to return. Most mornings, the old man's boots sounded a familiar rhythm against the dock. He had followed the same routine for over 20 years. Up before dawn, coffee in hand, checking the lines and cleats on his boat, a 1,987 cray named Mary. The hull bore the faded green of countless seasons, and though the winter storm last year had left its mark, he kept her seaworthy with steady hands and quiet care. He moved through the motions with the kind of efficiency that comes from repetition. At the helm, switches flicked on with a practiced touch. The engine coughed, then settled into its steady thrum. His hands traced the ropes, feeling for wear, knotting them tight without looking. The morning crept over the water, drawing silver out of the black, and gulls circled, waiting for scraps, as if they too knew the rhythm of his days. As he untied the lines and let them fall in neat coils, the boat drifted away from the dock. He turned toward open water, following the same route he'd taken hundreds of times, steering toward the spot where the fall currents drew in the striped base. The air was sharp, the coffee already losing its heat, and the old man let the quiet settle around him. Out here, the world shrank to the slap of water against the hull and the distant call of birds. He was miles from shore, the no-wake zone long behind him, when something changed. At first it was just a faint vibration, unfamiliar, out of place. He set his thermos down and listened. The sound grew louder, a mechanical pulse that pressed through the deck. Then, out of the mist, a Coast Guard cutter cut across his path, white hull slicing the water clean. Its approach was sudden, purposeful. He shut down his engine and waited, hands resting on the rail. The loudspeaker snapped on, and blue strobes lit the water. The cutter's wake rocked the Mary hard, and his thermos slid across the deck, coming to rest against the side. The officers lined the rail above, black boots steady, faces hidden behind mirrored sunglasses and the brims of their caps. The first officer boarded before the boats had fully steadied, voice sharp and commanding. "Hands where we can see them." The words broke the morning silence, scattering the gulls overhead. The old man complied, raising his arms, palms open. More boots thudded onto his deck, the noise swallowed by the cutter's engines. The sense of routine was gone, replaced by something colder, an interruption that would not be smoothed over by habit or time, just as the officers prepared to swarm the deck. A team of 3 boarding officers stepped onto the deck, boots thudding against the worn wood. Their formation was tight, practiced, and the youngest kept his sidearm drawn, finger resting along the trigger guard. "Stay exactly where you are." His voice was too loud, cracking under the weight of adrenaline. The old fisherman didn't move. He kept his hands visible on the wheel, palms pressed flat against the grain. Petty Officer Vasquez, the senior among them, barked orders before both feet were steady. "Check the holds. You two, the cabin. Santiago, watch him." His gaze never left the fisherman as the team split up, moving with brisk efficiency. Buckets were overturned, storage lockers yanked open, and fishing tackle clattered across the deck. One officer nudged a coiled rope aside with his boot, wary as if expecting something hidden beneath. Near the helm, a faded photograph slid from the dashboard and skittered across the deck, coming to rest by the old man's boot. He glanced down, jaw tightening, but said nothing. The officer closest to him, barely more than a recruit, caught the look and hesitated, but then shifted his focus back to the search. Small arms could be hidden anywhere, he muttered, peering into the shadows beneath the seats. Vasquez moved through the galley, flinging open cabinets and sending a loaf of bread tumbling onto the counter. Dishes rattled with each rough movement. "What's back here?" he demanded, wrenching open the narrow door to the tiny head. The fisherman finally spoke, voice low and even. "Mind the latch. It sticks in the cold." The sentence broke off, as a heavy step above sent a dull thud through the hull. The old man's head snapped up, shoulders tensing. The shift was small, but every officer in earshot reacted instantly, hands drifting toward their sidearms. Santiago drew his weapon, voice sharp. "Don't move." The command hung between them, the air dense with caution. The fisherman exhaled quietly, settling back against the wheel. His hands never left their place, but his fingers flexed once, slow and deliberate. The gesture was controlled, more practiced than nervous. Vasquez reappeared from below deck, empty-handed. His radio crackled with updates. Nothing found, just gear and old equipment. He studied the fisherman for a long moment, taking in the deep-set lines, the calm that never wavered. Protocol demanded thoroughness. "Johnson, run his name through the system," Vasquez said into his shoulder mic, eyes steady on the old man's face. Outside, gulls circled overhead, their cries lost against the low rumble of the cutter's engines. The fisherman's hands remained steady on the wheel, unmoving, as the search continued. Officer Santiago's attention sharpened as he moved in for the pat-down. The fisherman's jacket sleeve, pushed up just enough by the search, revealed a faded Navy anchor inked decades earlier. The edges of the tattoo were blurred, the blue-green lines softened by age and sun. Santiago paused, his training prompting him to look closer. This wasn't the generic ink you'd see on any old dock worker. The anchor's proportions and placement were regulation, the kind you'd get from a Navy base, not a boardwalk parlor. It was a detail easily missed, but to someone who knew what to look for, it stood out. Santiago's hand hovered for a second longer over the man's wrist. He glanced up, searching the fisherman's face for a reaction. The old man only looked past him, eyes steady, not offering any explanation. Santiago's suspicion ticked upward. He finished the pat-down, hands moving with more care, suddenly aware that this wasn't just a routine check. The anchor tattoo had shifted the mood. There was now a question hanging in the air. Was this man simply a fisherman, or was there something more beneath the surface? Santiago broke the silence. "You serve?" His voice was low, almost conversational, but the question carried weight. The fisherman didn't answer. Instead, he watched a gannet dive into the water behind the cutter, the small movement of his head the only acknowledgement. Santiago took in the silence, then resumed the search, his hands methodically checking the man's pockets. He found only a worn wallet and a handkerchief, nothing unusual, but the tattoo lingered in his mind. Inside the cabin, another officer rifled through drawers, sending papers and fishing hooks scattering across the small space. Each slam of a drawer made the fisherman's jaw tighten, but he kept his stance. Vasquez, watching from the doorway, caught the set of the man's shoulders. He knew the look controlled, measured, but he focused on the task at hand. The search had to continue. A drawer clattered to the floor, spilling tide charts and pencils. The fisherman's right hand twitched toward his thigh, a movement so subtle it might have gone unnoticed. But Santiago, still watching, caught it. It wasn't nervousness, it was restraint, the kind that comes from training. The anchor tattoo and the man's composure painted a picture that didn't quite fit with the rest of his story. Santiago stepped back, reporting, "Clean." He kept his eyes on the fisherman, noting how the man's thumb brushed his index finger in a slow, steady rhythm. The old man's gaze was unwavering, patient. No anger, no fear, just waiting for what came next. Vasquez nodded, signaling for the search to move on. The officers shifted their focus, preparing to check the engine compartment. As the boat rocked gently beneath them and sunlight flickered across the deck, Santiago's curiosity lingered on that faded Navy anchor. The first real clue that something about this fisherman and this search wasn't as simple as it seemed. Vasquez turned to the fisherman, asking for identification. The old man reached into his jacket, moving with the same careful precision, and Santiago watched, alert for anything else that might break the surface. The fisherman's wallet came free from his jacket, but as he pulled it out, something small and metallic slipped from his pocket and hit the deck with a muted clink. It spun once and came to rest near Santiago's boot. The officer stooped to pick it up, his eyes never leaving the old man. He turned the object over in his hand to tarnished metal, its 5-pointed star unmistakable even through the patina. The ribbon was faded, frayed at the edge, but the metal shape and the faint wreath made its meaning clear. Santiago recognized it as a Medal of Honor, or a Navy Cross replica, the kind awarded for extraordinary valor. He brushed his thumb over the nearly worn smooth engraving on the back, feeling the weight of history in his palm. Santiago held the medal up, letting it dangle from its threadbare ribbon. "You drop this?" His tone was neutral, but the question was loaded. The fisherman's gaze flicked to the medal, then back to Santiago, his face unchanged. He didn't reach for it, or offer an explanation. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the distant call of gulls and the low hum of the cutter's engine. Vasquez stepped in, taking the wallet from the fisherman's outstretched hand. He snapped it open and scanned the fishing license inside. "Benjamin Wilson," he read aloud, voice flat. The name hung in the air for a moment. Vasquez's expression shifted. He didn't toss the medal aside or dismiss it. Instead, he set it carefully next to the console, his eyes darting between the name and the medal. The old man's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Behind them, another officer continued searching, tossing bedding out of the cabin and onto the deck. A pillowcase landed near the medal, momentarily covering it. The fisherman's eyes tracked the movement, but he made no move to retrieve it. Santiago watched, uneasy. The way the fisherman looked at the medal wasn't sentimental, but there was a quiet recognition there, a familiarity that suggested more than just a keepsake. Vasquez handed the wallet back, his attention split between the name, the medal, and the ongoing search. The fisherman caught the wallet and tucked it away in one smooth motion. As the officers moved to new compartments, the fisherman bent to lift the pillowcase, folding it neatly before picking up the medal. He ran his thumb across its surface, then slipped it into his breast pocket, the gesture practiced and unobtrusive. Santiago pretended to check a storage locker, but his focus remained on the old man. He noticed how the fisherman's hand lingered at his jacket, pressing lightly over the pocket, as if to confirm the medal was still there. The radio on Vasquez's belt crackled with static, dispatch working to pull up records on Benjamin Wilson. The fisherman stood quietly by the wheel, his shadow stretching across the deck as the sun climbed higher. The search continued, boots scuffing against wood, the officers' movements growing more impatient as they found nothing out of place. Santiago kept glancing at the medal's outline beneath the fisherman's jacket, the image of that star-shaped honor lingering in his mind as the tension on deck began to build. After checking every compartment, locker, and storage nook, the officers found only fishing tackle, spare parts, and a half-eaten sandwich. The air on deck grew heavier with each passing minute. Officer Vasquez wiped his brow, salt and sweat mixing on his sleeve, his patience thinning. He called out updates over the radio, each one echoing the same result. Nothing suspicious, nothing hidden, nothing but the tools of an ordinary fisherman. The old man sat quietly on an overturned bucket near the stern, hands resting on his knees. His answers to their questions had been even and brief. He was alone. No, he hadn't seen any other boats. Yes, those were his permits. When Vasquez pressed about why he was out so early, the fisherman simply replied, "Tide was right." He looked out over the water, his focus drifting beyond the officers to the pale horizon. Santiago watched him closely, noting the small details. The way the fisherman's fingers curled around the bucket, the slow, measured breathing each time a locker slammed shut. He didn't seem nervous, if anything. He was too controlled, his stillness deliberate. Santiago's eyes tracked the fisherman's gaze as it flicked once to the console, then back to Vasquez. Vasquez moved across the deck, boots landing heavily on the worn planks. He stopped in front of the fisherman, blocking the sun. "You sure you've told us everything?" he asked, voice flat. The fisherman met his eyes. "Yes." There was nothing defensive in the answer, just a finality that left no room for argument. Vasquez's jaw tightened. He gestured to Santiago. "Check his registration again. Run a full background, local, federal, everything." Santiago nodded and reached for his radio, fingers steady as he keyed in the request. "Benjamin Wilson," he relayed to dispatch, the name carrying across the water. The fisherman exhaled quietly, his eyes following a gull that circled overhead. The boat rocked beneath them, water tapping gently against the hull. The officers shifted, the heat building as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Santiago glanced from the fisherman to the radio, waiting for something ending to break the silence. Vasquez folded his arms and stood by the rail. "We'll see what comes back on you," he muttered, more to himself than to the old man. The radio hissed, static rising and falling. Somewhere out of sight, a computer searched for answers in distant records. The fisherman adjusted his cap, pulling the brim lower, the metal in his pocket a quiet weight. He didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. A tense quiet settled over the deck. The officers watched the fisherman, watched the radio, watched the slow sweep of the sun across the water. Then, a burst of static cut through the air. The radio came to life, its voice breaking the silence and drawing every eye on deck. Petty Officer Vasquez pressed the radio to his ear, his stance rigid as he listened. The team, still and silent, watched him, the search forgotten. Sunlight caught the edge of the deck, but no one moved. Vasquez's brow furrowed, his face shifting from irritation to uncertainty as the transmission played out. Static faded, replaced by a clipped, urgent voice from base command. "You've boarded Captain Benjamin Wilson, Medal of Honor recipient. Wrong vessel. Aboard immediately." The words hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Vasquez's grip tightened on the radio, his knuckles whitening. He didn't answer right away. The deck felt smaller, the air heavier. The junior officer by the cooler set aside what he was holding, gaze flicking from Vasquez to the fisherman and back again. Santiago, standing near the stern, caught the change in Vasquez's posture, a sudden stiffness, a kind of caution that hadn't been there before. The old man remained seated on the bucket, eyes steady on Vasquez. His hands were loose, resting on his knees, but he watched every movement. The wind shifted, tugging at the corner of his jacket and exposing the faded tattoo on his forearm for a moment before the fabric settled back. Vasquez stared at the fisherman, his mind racing. The name, the medal, the order to abort it all landed at once. He looked down at the medal on the console, its tarnished star catching a sliver of light. The ribbon's frayed edge curled against the wood, a quiet reminder of the authority behind the voice on the radio. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the gentle slap of water against the hull. Vasquez swallowed, his throat tight. The weight of the mistake settled across the deck, pressing against the backs of every officer. He lowered the radio, moving slowly, as if every action now required a second thought. The rest of the team waited, eyes fixed on Vasquez, searching his face for direction. The radio, still in his hand, hissed softly with residual static. The order was clear, but it was the name Captain Benjamin Wilson, Medal of Honor recipient, that echoed loudest. The fisherman's gaze didn't waver. He seemed to recognize the shift, the sudden respect in the officers' faces, but he didn't move or speak. The metal on the console glinted as the boat rocked gently beneath them. Vasquez's shoulders dropped a fraction. He looked at his team, then back at the old man. The authority in his posture faded, replaced by something closer to uncertainty. He took a breath, steadying himself, and prepared to speak this time, not as a searcher, but as someone who had just learned who was sitting in front of him. Vasquez's voice was quieter now, almost formal. "Captain Benjamin Wilson, Navy Cross, and Medal of Honor recipient." He said the words with care, each syllable heavy. The fisherman's hands stayed on his knees, but a slow nod acknowledged the name. For a moment, The deck felt smaller, the air dense with the weight of what had just been revealed. Santiago stood frozen, his gaze darting between Vasquez and the man on the bucket. The junior officer's clipboard slipped from his hand and landed on the deck, but no one paid it any mind. Vasquez's posture shifted, spine straightening as if pulled by an old reflex, and when he spoke again, the word "sir" came out, rough and automatic. His earlier authority was gone, replaced by a measured respect that felt unfamiliar on his tongue. Captain Wilson watched Vasquez closely, his expression unreadable. The lines around his eyes caught the morning light, making him look older, but his presence seemed to fill the space. The wind tugged at his cap, and he sat there for a moment longer before standing, using the gunwale for balance. He moved with the same deliberate care he'd shown all morning, but now every officer on deck noticed the precision in his movements. Vasquez gave the order to stand down, his voice rougher than before. The officers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances, but the tone left no room for argument. The officer by the cabin door let his hand drop from his sidearm. Wilson's eyes flicked over the team, reading their faces, but he said nothing. He stepped past Vasquez to the console, picked up the tarnished medal, and slipped it back into his breast pocket. The motion was unhurried, practiced, as if returning something to its rightful place. Santiago's mind raced through the details. The bearing, the tattoo, the medal. It was all there, plain as day. He looked at Wilson's hands broad, scarred, steady. These were not just the hands of a fisherman, and the realization sat heavy in his chest. Vasquez radioed the cutter, his voice clipped. Abort search. Repeat, abort search. On the larger ship, crew members shifted behind the windows, waiting for instructions. Wilson watched, his face giving nothing away. He looked tired, but not at all surprised. The team began to move, slowly at first. Equipment was holstered, lockers closed. Their confidence from earlier had faded, replaced by confusion and a quiet uncertainty. Wilson walked to the helm, his boots steady on the rocking deck. He settled his hand on the wheel, fingers curling around the worn wood with a familiarity that needed no explanation. Vasquez tried to speak, but Wilson silenced him with a single look. The engine turned over at the key's twist, its cough startling the officers who lingered on the deck. Santiago stepped forward, voice low. "We didn't know." The words sounded thin, but Wilson didn't respond. He adjusted the throttle, the boat shivering beneath him, ready to move. Vasquez signaled for his team to clear the deck. They retreated, one nearly stumbling in his haste. Wilson waited until every officer was off his boat before he reached for the mooring lines, freeing them with practiced hands. As his boat drifted from the cutter, the gap of water between them widened, sunlight glancing off the back of his jacket. On the Coast Guard vessel, the officers gathered in a loose group, silent, watching as Captain Benjamin Wilson turned his bow toward open water. Behind him, the deck was scattered with the remnants of the search, and the morning air felt changed heavier, quieter as the realization settled over everyone left behind. The officers moved with new caution, each gesture deliberate. The junior officer gathered the scattered fishing tackle, hands unsteady as he tried to coil the line. Another righted the overturned bucket, placing it back against the gunwale. Their boots made dull sounds on the deck, lacking the confidence from earlier. Santiago retrieved a pillowcase from near the console, folding it with unnecessary care before handing it to Wilson. The old man took it without a word, eyes unreadable, his posture unchanged. He neither acknowledged the discomfort swirling around him, nor gave any sign of relief or resentment. He stood as he always had, steady, patient, waiting for the moment to pass. Vasquez lingered near the stern, radio in hand. His jaw worked, lips parting as if to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The other officers looked to him for direction, but he offered none. Instead, he stepped forward and held out the fisherman's license, the edges still creased from being handled roughly. Beside him, the younger officer extended the medal, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it in Wilson's palm. Wilson took both items, tucking the license into his jacket and holding the medal for a moment longer. He looked down at it, thumb brushing over the star's worn surface. As he tucked the metal away, Wilson only said, "Mistakes happen." His voice was calm, free of accusation. The words hung in the air, simple and final. Vasquez's remorse showed in the way he lowered his head, shoulders slumping. There was no formal apology, no long explanation. The gesture, the careful return of what mattered, was all he could offer. Wilson accepted it with a nod, the smallest sign of understanding passing between them. The rest of the team finished their cleanup, moving around Wilson with a quiet respect. They returned items to their places, straightened what they had disturbed. Santiago watched the old man adjust his cap, then step toward the helm. Wilson's movements remained unhurried, as if this interruption was only a brief pause in a much longer routine. Vasquez stood back, silent, as Wilson prepared to leave. The engine started with a low rumble, and the fisherman guided his boat away from the cutter. The officers watched from the deck, their earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something closer to humility. No one spoke as Wilson's boat slipped away, the distance between them widening with every passing second. The sun was higher now, throwing silver across the water. The officers remained at the rail, watching until the small green hull faded into the light. The day moved on, but the apology lingered unspoken, incomplete, yet understood. Wilson's boat disappeared toward the horizon, and the officers turned back to their duties, each one changed by the encounter. The water calmed, the gulls circled overhead, and routine waited to be resumed. The next morning, Wilson returned to the dock as usual, moving through his routine with quiet precision. He untied his boat and set out before sunrise, the metal tucked safely in his jacket pocket. The old thermos sat by the helm, the lines were checked, and the engine turned over with its familiar cough. If anyone watched from the shore, they would have seen nothing out of place, just a fisherman heading out, as he had for years. On the water, Wilson kept to his usual grounds, casting his line with the same steady hand. A Coast Guard cutter appeared on the horizon for a moment but continued on its way, showing no interest in his small green boat. The rhythm of the day returned, but its undertone was different. The weight of the metal was a quiet reminder of what had happened, but Wilson let the hours pass without dwelling on it. Word of the aborted search spread quickly among the local Coast Guard crews. No official apology was ever filed, but the story traveled from one station to the next. A routine boarding had turned into something else entirely. Officers who hadn't been there heard about the old fisherman with the Navy Cross and Medal of Honor, and about the moment the search was called off. Some talked about the mistake in hushed tones, passing along the details with more care than gossip usually earned. Others simply took it as a lesson, quietly adjusting the way they approached the boats they boarded, especially when the name Benjamin Wilson appeared on a manifest. For Wilson, the interruption faded into the background of his days. He fished, he cleaned his catch, and he returned to the dock as the sun set. He nodded to the harbor master, exchanged a few words with the bait shop clerk, and kept to himself. The metal remained in his pocket, its presence neither a burden nor a comfort, just another piece of his history, carried without fanfare. That afternoon, a small skiff approached while Wilson was checking his lines. Santiago sat at the tiller, out of uniform, a plain windbreaker zipped against the breeze. He drifted close, raised a hand, and waited for a nod before tying off. There were no radios, no orders, just a quiet greeting and a six-pack of beer offered with an awkward smile. Wilson accepted one, the gesture enough to settle the air between them. They fished together in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. Santiago's cast landed wide, his hands unpracticed, but Wilson didn't correct him. The beer cans sat in the cup holders, warming in the sun. Neither spoke much, but the quiet was easy, filled only by the gentle sound of water against the hull. As the day faded, Santiago packed up his gear and paused, before stepping back into his skiff. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words, but only managed, "Maybe I could come out again sometime?" Wilson looked up from his line, studied the younger man for a moment, and nodded once. Santiago exhaled, a bit of tension leaving his shoulders, and pushed off, the skiff gliding away across the water. Wilson watched him go, then gathered his tackle and started the engine. The dock lights flickered on as he tied up for the night, the metal still in his pocket. He moved with the same steady purpose, but the memory of the day lingered, quiet and unresolved. The next morning would bring another chance for routine, but something in the air had shifted, waiting for whatever might come next. Santiago arrived at the dock early, the air cool and carrying the scent of salt. Wilson was already there, coiling a length of rope with practiced ease. Santiago lingered for a moment, watching the old man's hands steady, unhurried, as if nothing from the day before lingered in his mind. When Wilson looked up, his face gave nothing away. "You came back," Wilson said, not as a question but as a simple observation. Santiago nodded, shifting his weight. His uniform felt stiff, the badge heavier than usual. "Had to," he replied, voice rougher than he meant. He searched for more words but found none that fit. Wilson finished with the rope, then picked up a bucket of bait, shaking a bit of water from his fingers before tossing a handful into the harbor. Gulls circled overhead, their cries sharp in the morning quiet. Santiago watched, uncertain how to start. He finally said, "I looked you up. After everything." The statement hung between them, heavy, but honest. Wilson didn't react. He wiped his hands on his pants, leaving faint streaks. Santiago hesitated, then added, "You could have said something. When we boarded." His voice was quieter now, edged with regret. Wilson met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Anger is heavy. I choose to carry only what's necessary." The words were quiet, but they landed with weight. Santiago thought about how quickly frustration had colored their search, how certainty had closed him off from seeing the man in front of him. They stood in silence, only the water lapping against the pilings. Wilson turned toward his boat and motioned for Santiago to follow. "Tide's turning," he said, stepping aboard with the same measured steps he'd used the day before. Santiago joined him, and Wilson handed him the bowline, nodding toward the cleat. Santiago fumbled at first, the knot slipping from his fingers. Wilson watched, saying nothing, but after a moment he demonstrated the proper knot symbol, efficient, holding fast. Santiago tried again, this time getting it right. Wilson gave a small nod, a quiet approval that carried more meaning than words. They cast off and moved out onto the water, the engine's low hum filling the space between them. The sun climbed higher, painting the waves in shifting gold. Neither man spoke for a long while. Santiago watched Wilson's hands on the wheel, the way he adjusted the course by feel alone. He thought about the tattoo, the metal, and the steady patience that had marked every gesture. When they reached the fishing grounds, Wilson cut the engine and handed Santiago a rod. The gesture was simple, but it felt like an invitation. They fished side by side, the silence comfortable. Santiago reeled in his line, feeling the weight of the water and the lesson settling in. As the sun dipped lower, they headed back to the dock. Santiago coiled the rope neatly this time, his hands remembering the motion. Wilson watched, then gave a brief nod of approval. No more needed to be said. Santiago lingered as Wilson walked away, boots thudding softly against the dock. He watched the old man disappear into the fading light, the lesson clear but unspoken. Some things changed quietly, beneath the surface, and the day's events would find their own way into the stories told along the docks and in the quiet spaces of the station. Legacy, in places like the Coast Guard station, doesn't announce itself. It settles into routines, reshapes habits, and leaves its mark in the way people move and speak. After the morning on Wilson's boat, the culture at the station shifted. Now, every tip is triple-checked before boarding. Officers pause before stepping onto a deck, weighing what they know against what they might be missing. It's not written up in any report, but everyone knows. Caution has replaced certainty. New recruits hear the story during orientation. It's told under the heading Judgment Calls, a cautionary tale about the old fisherman with the Navy Cross and Medal of Honor, the search that halted with a single radio call, and the lesson that followed. The details change in each retelling, but the core remains. Sometimes, the person you're searching has already carried more weight than you can imagine. Wilson's presence on the water is unchanged. He launches before sunrise, his boat gliding away from the dock with the same quiet efficiency. The gulls still follow, and the lines are set with practiced hands. If a Coast Guard skiff passes nearby, it slows just enough to acknowledge him, then moves on. There's no wave, no greeting, just a shared understanding that needs no words. Santiago, now a lieutenant, carries the lesson with him. He's stopped talking about it directly, but it shapes him in ways he doesn't always notice. His movements on deck are more economical, his decisions slower, more deliberate. Even at home, his wife notices how he folds laundry or ties knots, small echoes of the old man's habits. He visits Wilson when he can, sometimes to talk, more often just to share the silence. The photograph Wilson handed him a faded image of young sailors, faces blurred by time-zits in his locker. Cadets sometimes ask about it during inspections. Santiago tells them to focus on their knots, but the story lingers in the background, quiet and persistent. Rumors about Wilson's past circulate among the crews. Some say he once held a bridge alone for days. Others whisper about covert missions in distant waters. Wilson never confirms or denies any of it. He keeps fishing, the medal tucked away, the tattoo hidden beneath his sleeve. His legacy isn't in the stories themselves, but in the way the station has changed, a little slower to judge, a little quicker to listen. On the dock, Santiago sometimes watches Wilson work, noting the absence of wasted motion, the patience in every gesture. He recognizes the lesson for what it is, not a warning, but a quiet guide. The memory of that morning on the water settles in, not as a regret, but as a reminder. Some legacies are carried in stories, others in the way hands move or decisions are made. As another day ends, Wilson's boat heads for open water, the medal's weight carried quietly in his pocket. Some heroes don't draw attention to themselves. The lesson from Wilson's story is clear. Quiet dignity and careful judgment matter, especially when the truth isn't obvious. The medal in his pocket stands as a reminder that respect is earned in silence as often as in ceremony, and that a single moment of humility can prevent a lasting injustice. The sea remains indifferent to rank or reputation. Everyone faces it on equal terms. But for those who listen and look closer, there's always something to learn. Have you ever realized you misjudged someone? Share your story in the comments below.